Imagine a rainy night in New York City. The streets are wet, the car lights reflect in the puddles, and the city's frenetic pace seems to slow down, but just for a moment. Inside one of the city's most renowned hospitals, a doctor makes a choice that will change not only her life, but also the life of a man forgotten by society. This is a story about compassion, courage, and the surprises life can bring. Get ready to dive into an emotional narrative where the unexpected happens and the true riches of life are revealed. Night had fallen over New York, bringing with it a cold and persistent rain that seemed endless. The city streets, normally vibrant and full of life, were now covered by a thin layer of water, reflecting the lights of cars and tall buildings. Those still braving the outdoors hurried along, trying to avoid getting wetter than necessary. The wind blew strong, making the leaves of the few trees sway and scattering small pieces of paper across the sidewalks. Inside the Central Hospital of New York, the atmosphere was equally tense, but for different reasons. The Central Hospital was one of the largest and most renowned in the city, a true giant of concrete and glass standing imposingly in the middle of the urban jungle. Its emergency rooms were always crowded, a cruel reflection of urban life, where accidents, diseases, and personal tragedies seemed to multiply without warning. And on that rainy night, the frenetic pace seemed to have reached a new peak. Dr. Emily Carter, a doctor in her early 30s, was at the center of this storm. Emily was known for her unwavering dedication and compassionate heart, qualities that set her apart in an environment often impersonal and driven by rigid protocols. With her brown hair hastily tied back in a bun and her face slightly marked by the fatigue of long shifts, she walked through the bustling corridors of the emergency room with firm steps but full of empathy. With each step, her sharp eyes scanned the faces of patients, seeking to identify those who needed the most attention, something she did with a naturalness that seemed almost intuitive. However, that night, something in the air felt different. Perhaps it was the somber weather outside, or maybe it was the fact that Emily was beginning to feel the weight of her own doubts about the system she worked in. In recent months, she had noticed a growing disconnect between what she believed to be the true purpose of medicine, caring for people, regardless of their situation, and the bureaucratic realities that seemed increasingly stifling. In a system where profit and efficiency were often prioritized over human care, Emily felt that her vocation was being tested every day. It was while she was making her rounds, checking patients and giving quick instructions to residents, that the urgent call came. Unaccompanied patient, no identification, found unconscious on the street. "He's on his way," announced one of the triage nurses, with a tone that revealed the unsettling familiarity with such situations. Emily, who was about to enter a room to examine a patient with a high fever, paused for a moment, feeling a small knot form in her stomach. She knew that many of her colleagues viewed cases like this as problematic. No insurance, no identification, and almost always no one to claim them. "Bring him to room 3, Emily said, her voice firm but loaded with a determination she herself didn't know where it came from. She changed her course and went straight to the indicated emergency room, mentally preparing herself for whatever was to come. Upon entering the room, she noticed that the nurses were already organizing the equipment, moving with the efficiency of a team that had seen it all. However, there was something in their faces, a certain indifference perhaps, that bothered Emily. To them, this was just another case among many, a case that, at best, would be quickly transferred to another less prestigious hospital. When the doors to the room opened and the paramedics came in with the stretcher, Emily saw the man they had brought for the first time. He was soaked from the rain, with gray hair plastered to his head and a face marked by deep wrinkles. His clothes were dirty and tattered, suggesting he had spent a long time on the streets. There was a pallor to his skin that indicated significant blood loss, and his lips were almost blue, probably due to the cold and lack of proper circulation. His eyes were closed, and for a brief moment, Emily wondered if he was still alive. He was on the sidewalk, no signs of apparent violence. "Just collapsed," reported one of the paramedics as they transferred the man from the stretcher to the hospital bed. Emily nodded, quickly assessing the patient's condition. Her fingers found a weak but still present pulse, and she realized that he was breathing, although irregularly. There was something on his chest, a dark spot that began to worry Emily. She immediately ordered an X-ray and other tests to identify the cause of the emergency. "Let's stabilize him first. We need to find out what's going on," Emily said, already taking command of the situation. The team around her quickly got to work, connecting the man to monitors, inserting in 4-line, and preparing the necessary medications. However, while Emily coordinated the care, one of the residents, a young doctor still new to the profession, approached her with a worried look. "Dr. Carter, wouldn't it be better to transfer him to the public hospital? They have more experience with cases like this," he suggested, almost hesitantly. Emily looked at the resident, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. She knew he was just repeating what he had been taught, that cases like this, without insurance or family, were better managed elsewhere. But to Emily, this man was not just a case. He was a person, someone who deserved care, someone who, for reasons she still didn't know, seemed to be depending on her. "No," Emily replied firmly. "He's here now, and we're going to treat him here. Let's find out what's going on and do everything we can to save him." The resident nodded, perhaps surprised by the determination in her voice, but didn't question her further. Emily turned her attention back to the man on the bed, feeling a weight in her chest that wasn't related to the stress of work. Who was he? Why was he there, alone, in that condition? Questions that had no answers yet, but that didn't matter at the moment. What mattered was that he was alive, and she would do everything she could to keep him that way. As the rain continued to fall outside, Emily couldn't imagine that that night would change her life forever. The rain continued to drum against the hospital windows, as if the very sky were crying for those whom New York City had forgotten. Inside the emergency room, the atmosphere was a mixture of noise and tension. Machines beeped rhythmically, nurses and doctors murmured instructions, and hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors. At the center of it all was Dr. Emily Carter, her eyes fixed on the cardiac monitor of the man who had just arrived. The monitor showed an irregular heartbeat, a clear sign that something was terribly wrong. Blood pressure dropping, 70/40. One of the nurses reported, without lifting her eyes from the monitor. Emily furrowed her brow, feeling the weight of the situation increase. She knew she needed to act quickly. The man, still unnamed, was on the verge of total collapse, and unless they discovered the cause, he wouldn't survive. She quickly examined the X-rays and the results of the initial tests that had been conducted. There was something unusual in his lungs, an opacity that could indicate a severe infection or even internal trauma. "Could be a pneumothorax," Emily murmured to herself, trying to piece together the puzzle. But there was also the issue of blood. The tests showed severe anemia, suggesting the man was losing blood internally, but there were no external signs of serious injuries. What was happening to him? As Emily analyzed the data, she felt a presence beside her. It was Dr. Stephen Mitchell, the head of the emergency department, an imposing man with decades of experience. He quickly glanced at the monitors and the tests before turning his attention to Emily. "Emily, what do we have here?" he asked, with a tone that mixed curiosity and authority. "Unidentified patient, found unconscious on the street. Weak pulse, low blood pressure, suspected internal bleeding, and possible pneumothorax," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the stress. Dr. Mitchell furrowed his brow, and Emily knew what he was thinking. In a hospital where every minute and resource was precious, spending so much time and effort on an unidentified and uninsured patient was not just imprudent, it was almost taboo. "Have you considered transferring him to the public hospital?" he asked, almost automatically. Emily knew this was the question he would ask. It was protocol, after all, but something inside her revolted against the idea. The image of that frail, vulnerable man fighting for his life with no one by his side weighed heavily on her conscience. It wasn't the first time she faced such a decision, but for some reason, that night, this choice seemed harder than ever. Stephen, he might not survive the transfer, she said, looking directly into the chief's eyes. "If we don't do something now, he's going to die." Dr. Mitchell kept his gaze steady, but Emily could see that he was considering her words. He was a pragmatic man, someone who had seen more deaths than he could count, and who understood the importance of prioritizing resources in a hospital like this. But he also knew Emily, knew she was an exceptional doctor who rarely let her emotions interfere with her professional judgment. "Emily," he began in a softer tone, "I understand your concern, but we need to think practically. We don't have all the resources in the world here, and we need to be prepared for any emergency. We can't save everyone." Those words, although spoken gently, felt like a blow to Emily's heart. We can't save everyone. It was a painful truth she had learned over the years, but even so, each time she heard those words, something inside her broke. To Emily, medicine had never been about statistics or probabilities. It was about people, about human beings who deserved a chance to fight, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "I understand, Stephen," she replied, her voice softer, but still firm. "But if there's a chance to save this man, even if it's small, I have to try. He's here now, and transferring him could be a death sentence." Dr. Mitchell sighed, looking again at the patient, who lay motionless on the bed, surrounded by machines monitoring every sign of life. He seemed to be reflecting on Emily's words, weighing the consequences of his actions. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Emily. But you understand that if something goes wrong, there will be consequences. Not just for him, but for you too." Emily knew what he was implying. In a hospital where rules were followed to the letter, deviating from protocols could be costly. But she had already made her decision. "I'm aware," she replied without hesitation, "and I accept the responsibility." Dr. Mitchell looked at her for a few more seconds, as if trying to assess how much she was willing to risk. Finally, he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before stepping away. "Good luck, Dr. Carter," he said, before leaving the room. With the chief's departure, Emily felt a wave of relief, but also responsibility. The decision had been made, and now it was all or nothing. She looked at her team, who were waiting for her next instructions. "Let's start preparing for a thoracostomy," she said with an authority that no one questioned. "We need to stabilize him before anything else." The nurses and doctors moved quickly, preparing the necessary equipment while Emily focused on the man on the bed. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the irregular movement of his breathing. His skin was cold to the touch, and Emily knew that every minute counted. "You're in good hands," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "We're going to get you through this." As the rain continued to beat against the windows, Emily knew she had made the right choice. And deep down, she hoped that the universe would recognize this act of faith, of compassion, and give her the chance to prove that sometimes the right thing to do is simply what needs to be done, regardless of the consequences. The dawn broke timidly over New York, with the sun still struggling to break through the gray clouds that lingered in the sky. The rain had subsided, turning into a light drizzle that left the city with a damp, almost melancholic sheen. At Central Hospital, the routine began to intensify again as shifts changed and the morning doctors and nurses took over. For Dr. Emily Carter, however, the start of the day brought a sense of uncertainty she couldn't shake. The previous night had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. After hours of intense work, Emily and her team had finally managed to stabilize the unnamed man. The thoracostomy had been a success, relieving the pressure on his collapsed lung, and they had found and treated the source of the internal bleeding. However, he was still in critical condition, and Emily knew that the next few hours would be decisive. As she watched the cardiac monitor, which now showed a more stable rhythm, a slight sense of relief washed over her. But before she could allow herself to relax, the emergency room door burst open with a bang. It was one of the reception nurses, her face pale and her expression tense. "Dr. Carter, the administration wants to see you immediately," said the nurse, her voice low, almost as if she was hesitant to deliver the message. Emily felt her stomach turn. She knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any less frightening. Understood, Emily replied with a nod. She took one last look at the man on the bed, who remained unconscious, still fighting for his life. Please keep me informed of any changes, she told the team before leaving the room. The walk to the administration's meeting room felt longer than usual. Emily felt each step grow heavier, as if she were marching toward an impending judgment. She knew that her decision to treat the unidentified patient without following the usual protocol had challenged the hospital's norms. And though she had acted with the best of intentions, she was aware that it wouldn't exempt her from the consequences. Upon reaching the meeting room, Emily found Dr. Stephen Mitchell already waiting, accompanied by two members of the hospital's administrative board, their expressions impassive and distant. Dr. Richard Harris, the hospital's director, sat at the head of the table, his cold eyes fixed on Emily as she entered. "Emily, please, have a seat," Dr. Harris said with a hand gesture, but without offering any sign of cordiality. Emily obeyed, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on her. "We've received reports about a patient you treated last night," Dr. Harris began, his voice low but laden with authority. "A man with no identification, no insurance, who by all the hospital's standards and protocols should have been transferred to a public unit specialized in treating patients like him." Emily swallowed hard but maintained her firm posture. She knew her actions needed to be justified, and she was prepared to defend each one of them. "Yes, doctor. I made the decision to treat him here because I believed he wouldn't survive the transfer. He was in critical condition, and any delay could have cost him his life," she responded, trying to keep her voice steady and controlled. Dr. Harris leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "Dr. Carter, I understand that your intention was noble, but this hospital has clear rules for a reason. We have to consider the responsible use of resources, especially when dealing with patients who cannot pay for their treatment. Your decision put the hospital in a difficult position." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew he was right in a purely administrative sense, but that didn't lessen her conviction that she had done what was right. "With all due respect, Dr. Harris, I believe that as doctors, our primary duty is to save lives, regardless of the financial circumstances. This man was dying, and I had the responsibility to do everything possible to save him," she responded, trying to control the frustration that began to rise. Before Dr. Harris could respond, one of the board members, Mrs. Margaret Collins, a woman with a severe appearance and a calculating gaze, intervened. "Dr. Carter, no one is questioning your medical skills. However, what is in question here is the judgment you exercised in a situation that required more than just instinct. The hospital cannot function efficiently if each doctor decides unilaterally how resources will be allocated. Your choice, however well-intentioned, disregarded the system designed to ensure that all patients are treated fairly and within our capabilities." Emily felt the weight of those words, but even so, she couldn't convince herself that she had made a mistake. To her, that system was failing, and her action was an attempt to correct it, even if it was just for that single moment, for that single patient. "I understand what you're saying," Emily said in a calmer tone, "but I also believe that as doctors, we have a moral obligation to act in situations that require more than simply following protocols. If I had followed the protocol and he had died during the transfer, I would never have forgiven myself." Dr. Mitchell, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. "Emily, everyone here recognizes your talent and dedication. However, we need to think about the hospital as a whole. The situation here is complex, and the administration must make difficult decisions to maintain balance." Emily knew that these words, however kind they were, carried a final decision. Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair and sighed before speaking again. "Dr. Carter, it is with great regret that we have reached this decision, but considering the seriousness of the situation and the precedent your actions could set, we are forced to take disciplinary action. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your duties at Central Hospital." Those words fell on Emily like a crushing blow. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but she remained firm. She knew she had done what was right, even if it meant sacrificing her career. "Understood," she replied with a nod. "Thank you for the opportunity to explain my position." Without further words, she stood up and left the room, feeling a mix of despair and relief. Despair at knowing she had lost her job, and relief at knowing that deep down, she had followed her principles to the end. As she walked through the hospital corridors, now as a visitor, no longer as a doctor, Emily felt a new determination growing within her. This was just one battle in a much larger war, and she wasn't willing to give up so easily. The suspension of Dr. Emily Carter quickly became the most talked about subject among the staff at Central Hospital. Some expressed solidarity, recognizing her courage in following her instincts and saving a life, while others saw her actions as reckless, challenging a system that, though imperfect, was what kept the hospital running. However, no one could predict the twist that was about to unfold. After leaving the hospital that morning, Emily felt disoriented. Her mind was in turmoil, thinking about all the possibilities her decision had unleashed. She knew losing her job was a real possibility, but there was something in her conscience that comforted her, the fact that she had saved a life. That, for her, was what mattered. Days passed since Emily's suspension, and the man she had treated remained hospitalized, still fighting to recover from the trauma that had almost taken his life. She was no longer at the hospital to closely monitor his progress, but she had asked some colleagues to keep her informed about his condition. Her mind was constantly with that patient, whom she now silently referred to as John Doe, the term used to describe an unidentified person. While Emily tried to reorganize herself emotionally and think about her next steps, a series of events began to unfold, changing the course of the story. The man, who had remained in a coma until then, finally began to wake up. It was an ordinary morning at the hospital when he opened his eyes for the first time. The fluorescent light on the ceiling temporarily blinded him, causing him to blink several times before his eyes adjusted. He felt his body heavy, as if he were anchored by an invisible weight pulling him down. The sounds around him were muffled, but gradually began to become clearer. The constant beeping of the monitors, the hurried footsteps of the nurses, the muffled voices of the doctors discussing other cases. The nurse on duty immediately noticed the change in his condition. She quickly approached, observing his vital signs with renewed attention. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice soft and calm. The man blinked again, trying to focus. His throat was dry, and he felt pain when he tried to swallow. But after a moment, he managed to murmur something almost inaudible. "Water," was all he could say, his voice hoarse and weak. The nurse immediately grabbed a small cup of water and helped him drink, using a straw to make the process easier. After a few sips, the man felt his throat ease a little, and his mind began to clear. "Do you know where you are?" the nurse asked, observing him closely. He tried to remember, but his mind was a mess. Fragments of memory came and went, but nothing made sense. "Hospital," he managed to reply, still confused. "Yes, you're at Central Hospital in New York. You were found unconscious on the street a few days ago. We treated you, but we need to know more about who you are. Can you tell me your name?" There was a long pause. The man looked up at the ceiling, trying to remember something that seemed buried under a thick fog in his mind. And then, slowly, the memories began to emerge. My name is Anthony. Anthony Davis," he said finally, his voice firmer. The nurse's eyes widened in surprise. Anthony Davis. That name wasn't unfamiliar to her, though she couldn't remember exactly where she had heard it before. She quickly noted it on the chart and decided to inform the doctors immediately about the patient's identification. Meanwhile, Anthony Davis began to remember fragments of his life. He had been a businessman, that much he knew. And not just any businessman. He was one of the most successful in New York, with a fortune that placed him among the richest in the country. But then something went wrong. He was betrayed, his fortune evaporated, and he was thrown into a downward spiral that led him to lose everything. The bitterness of betrayal still burned in his soul, but he couldn't recall the details. The doctors quickly arrived in Anthony's room and began asking detailed questions, trying to piece together the story of the man who had previously been known only as a nameless homeless person. As they talked, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Anthony Davis had been a prominent figure in New York's high society until a few years ago when a devastating financial scandal ruined him. His partners, in a dirty move, incriminated him for a fraud scheme he didn't commit. And while he tried to clear his name, his fortune was drained by endless legal battles. Eventually, without money, without friends, and without the family that had abandoned him, Anthony found himself on the streets, a broken and hopeless man. "I don't know how I ended up on the sidewalk that night," he said, as his memory faltered in some parts. "I just remember wandering aimlessly, thinking about everything I'd lost, and then everything went dark." The doctors listened to his story with growing interest. It wasn't every day that an unidentified patient turned out to be someone so well known. The news of Anthony Davis's recovery quickly began to spread throughout the hospital, generating murmurs among the staff and a growing sense that something big was about to happen. Meanwhile, Dr. Emily Carter, who had not yet heard the news, was trying to keep her mind occupied at home. She spent her days reading medical articles and thinking about what she would do next. Her heart, however, remained at Central Hospital with that mysterious patient she had saved. It was then that her phone rang. It was one of the nurses who had worked with her the night Anthony Davis was brought to the hospital. "Emily, you're not going to believe what happened," the nurse said, her voice full of excitement. "The patient you saved, he woke up, and you won't believe who he is." Emily's heart began to race as she listened to the story. When the nurse finally revealed the patient's identity, Emily was in shock. "Anthony Davis? The businessman who disappeared years ago?" "Yes, him. And he wants to see you. He asked to meet you as soon as he learned you were the one responsible for saving his life." Emily was speechless. She knew life was unpredictable, but she could never have imagined that the man she had risked everything to save would be someone so important, someone whose story would shake not only her life, but perhaps the very system that had punished her. With a mix of anxiety and curiosity, Emily prepared to return to the hospital. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but she felt she was about to discover that sometimes the hardest choices we make are the ones that most transform our lives. And before we continue with this incredible story, we want to invite you to become part of our community. If you're enjoying this inspiring tale, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our future stories. Your interaction motivates us to bring you even more emotional stories like this one. Now, let's find out how this story unfolds. Dr. Emily Carter felt her heart race as she walked through the familiar corridors of Central Hospital in New York. There was something surreal about being back in that place so soon after her suspension, especially knowing that the reason for her visit was so unexpected. The news that the nameless man she had saved was actually Anthony Davis, a prominent former businessman, still echoed in her mind. As she advanced, memories of the last time she had been there mixed with the anxiety of what was about to happen. Finally, she reached Anthony's hospital room door. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm herself before entering. When she pushed open the door, she was greeted by a sight she didn't expect. Anthony Davis was sitting up in bed, still weak, but clearly conscious and lucid. He looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and curiosity. Beside the bed, a bouquet of fresh flowers added a touch of color to the clinical room. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice still hoarse but filled with emotion, "thank you for coming." Emily smiled gently, trying to hide the avalanche of feelings overwhelming her. "Mr. Davis, it's a pleasure to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to you," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "They told me you were the one who decided to treat me here, even when everyone else wanted to transfer me. I don't even know how to begin to thank you." Emily shook her head modestly. "I just did what any doctor would have done in my position. Your condition was critical, and I knew I needed to act quickly." Anthony looked at her with a slight smile, but his eyes conveyed something deeper, a realization that what she had done went beyond duty. You did more than that, Dr. Carter. You risked your career for a man who, that night, was nobody. I was just a homeless man, with no name, no identity. No one would have blamed you if you had sent me elsewhere. But you didn't do that. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. The sincerity and intensity of Anthony's gratitude deeply moved her. I couldn't leave you without help, Mr. Davis. Every life has value, no matter who it is or where they come from. Anthony paused, reflecting on her words. That's a perspective many people have lost, especially in the world I lived in for so many years. But I see that you still believe in it, and that's why I'm here today. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Anthony telling Emily more details about what had happened in his life before that fateful night. He spoke about the betrayal that had led to his downfall, about the friends who had abandoned him, and about the loneliness that had accompanied him as he wandered the streets of New York. Emily listened attentively, feeling a mix of empathy and sadness for what he had endured. Eventually, Anthony shifted the conversation, speaking in a firmer tone. Dr. Carter, I don't want what you did for me to go unnoticed or without positive consequences. I want to help repair the damage this situation has caused in your life. Emily raised her hand in a gesture of refusal. Mr. Davis, I didn't do this expecting anything in return. My only concern was your health. I know, he replied with a slight smile. And that's exactly why I want to do something. Because you acted without expecting anything in return. And because the world needs more people like you. The first thing I want to do is ensure that the injustice you suffered is corrected. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Emily. Anthony, recovering rapidly, used his influence and connections to expose the story of his salvation and Emily's subsequent suspension to the public. The case quickly gained media attention, turning Dr. Emily Carter into a modern-day heroine, someone who had defied norms to save a life without considering the consequences for herself. Public pressure grew on the administration of Central Hospital. Dr. Richard Harris and the board members found themselves in a difficult position. They tried to maintain their stance, justifying Emily's suspension as a necessary measure to maintain order and efficiency in the hospital, but the criticism intensified. Patients, staff, and the general public began to question whether a system that punished a doctor for saving a life was truly just. Within a few weeks, the pressure became unsustainable. The hospital was not only forced to revoke Emily's suspension, but also offered her a prominent position in the hospital's administration, recognizing her dedication and courage. However, Emily had already made her decision. She declined the offer, explaining that her vision of patient care no longer aligned with the administration of Central Hospital. It was then that Anthony Davis made a proposal that would change Emily's life and many others. Using the resources he still had, Anthony decided to establish a clinic dedicated to caring for vulnerable people, especially the homeless, who were often ignored by the traditional healthcare system. He invited Emily to be the medical director of this new clinic, giving her complete freedom to create an environment where human care was above all else. Emily accepted the proposal with gratitude, seeing in it the opportunity to finally carry out the work she had always believed in. The clinic, named the Carter Davis Clinic, soon became a symbol of compassion and care in New York, offering free medical treatment to those who needed it most. The clinic also served as an education center for young doctors, teaching them the importance of empathy and commitment to human life, regardless of any social or economic barriers. Months later, as Emily looked at the clinic full of life and hope, she reflected on the journey that had brought her there. The courageous decision on a rainy night in New York had not only saved a life, but also transformed her own, revealing that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from following the heart, even when the world seems against you. This story reminds us that the true value of a human being is not in their wealth or status, but in their humanity and how they are treated by those around them. Dr. Emily Carter risked everything to save a life that many would consider insignificant, and in doing so, she proved that every person deserves care and respect. Her act of courage not only saved Anthony Davis but also highlighted the importance of compassion and justice in a world often guided by impersonal rules and norms. Let us always remember that, in moments of decision, what truly matters is the life we touch and the changes we make, no matter how small. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the importance of compassion and courage, don't forget to show your support. Leave a like on this video, share this powerful message with your friends, and if you haven't yet, join us by subscribing to the channel. Here, you'll find more stories like this one, reminding us of life's deepest lessons. Your presence here makes all the difference. Until the next story,